Chapter 7. Growing Pains. Rayleigh ignored his environment. He felt like he was going to explode from the aching pain of torn muscles and ligaments. Focusing his senses on the giant before him, he did his best to block the sensations filling his head. He forced his right foot forward, stepping toward Hirian. Hirian, though exhausted, did not want to let Rayleigh gain an advantage. He moved to meet him. The speed of both combatants increased. Rayleigh grinding his teeth as he charged, pushing the limits of his human body. He kicked, flinging mud to cloud Hirian's vision. Then dashing to the right, he vanished from Hirian's sight and slipped behind the giant. Rayleigh threw a punch with all his strength, causing a kinetic explosion that blew away corpses and connecting with Hirian's ribs. The surrounding buildings amplified the sound, echoing it through the city. Rayleigh continued to push past his physical limits, his muscles tearing with every movement. His mind went blank from the pain, and he fell deeper into bloodlust, giving in more and more to the veil. Hirian, instinctively dodging most of the attacks thrown his way, avoided significant damage. Swinging his double-bladed axe wildly and trying to keep his ground, he used his raw strength to overpower Rayleigh and push him back, creating a bit of space to catch his breath. With every step, incredible pain rushed into his head. Watching from the sky, Rayleigh's raven circled the battlefield. Its cries mocked the action as it flapped up to a higher viewpoint. The muscles in Rayleigh's arms tore with every swing of the heavy sword. His entire body throbbed and ached. His internal organs had taken severe damage, draining his stamina and forcing him to a stop. The pressure he'd put on his muscles and organs was causing blood to leak from his nose and mouth. But the microorganisms continued to work, stitching his muscles back together, repairing the wear and tear on his organs, and creating a light field of electricity around his body. The field intensified, becoming visible even to the naked eye, as the machines worked to save the body they made their home. Each muscle thread recovered, improved, growing more robust and letting Rayleigh regain mobility. Willing himself through the pain, he continued to test his physical abilities. He was almost unceasingly slipping in and out of consciousness, and his eyesight started failing, causing him to lose track of Hirian. He awakened more of his dormant gifts, unable to control his body's evolution and the energy it drew from the veil. The power grew in density, collapsing on itself, creating a vacuum and drawing in the natural energy of his surroundings. Something awoke from the darkness within him and reached out in hunger to the dead soldiers, absorbing them, turning them into more energy. Enormous amounts of power that couldn't be absorbed by the broken bodies transformed into a cloud of blood, a fog of pure death that spread through the square. The dense energy hung there, suspended, waiting to be metabolized. Rayleigh's fatigue dissipated, but his body was already at its limits. The power he'd absorbed began to leak out. Aspects of his newfound abilities spread in all directions, attacking everything in their path. Allies and enemies alike created as much distance from him as they could. Rayleigh's powers continued to make it difficult for Rama to send in soldiers. Lilith marked the battleground with her eyes, tracking the electricity surging through the air. She knelt behind a wall, opened her senses, and focused on Rayleigh, tracking his heartbeat. She heard a screech from above.
"Don't interfere!"
A raven landed in front of her.
"You will not interfere!"
The bird had grown remarkably after being enveloped in the veiled energy. It also exuded shadowy energy similar to Rayleigh's. Lilith stepped back to look at the animal. Unable to completely cut herself off from Rayleigh, she matched her movements to the rhythm of his pulse and found she could predict the energy bursts erupting from Rayleigh's body. Closing her eyes, she focused on the power pulsing out of his body. The machines in his bloodstream were the cause of the vibrations. They were amplifying the natural electrical currents, stimulating all the power in Rayleigh's body as if it was a battery and sending it erupting outwards. The electromagnetic waves then affected the organic machines in others' bodies. Burning embers sparked in Rayleigh's soul and exploded outward from the pit of his stomach. The energy spread like wildfire, filling his body and awakening his natural power. Intense heat flared up and then condensed on itself, covering his body and causing the veil's vacuum of raw energy to collapse. He looked like he was covered in fire. The raw power lit up like a beacon, drawing the attention of everyone in the city. Fighting stopped. As his radiation grew, consuming all the energy around him. It pushed outward, seeming sentient as it searched for more substances to feed on and grow. The flames erupted again, even hotter, and turned on Rayleigh himself, burning the skin from his body. Plowing into the town square, 50 men followed Berlin and converging on the panicked giants. Yoshi pushed ahead, cutting down the tree-like figures with nimble strikes. Explosions and aftershocks reverberated through the ground, but they pushed forward, smashing and trampling the ground like wild horses, carving a path toward Tyrene. The remaining forces were preparing to enter the town square. Lewis dashed about with his spear, covering a wide area. In one motion, he scanned his surroundings. Tossing his spear into the sky, he teleported himself to it in an instant. He paused long enough to take in a bird's-eye view of the town. Berlin and Yoshi were visible, clearing a path toward Tyrene and the Band of the Wolf, but he saw no signs of large battles. Birds were gathering above the western gate. Crows with full bellies mocked those on the battlefield as they fed on fresh corpses. Crimson and blue mist flowing through the streets, as if it was alive. Walker Forenza walked out of the blood mist, clearing it behind him. A full army followed him toward the square where Rayleigh was engaged with Hirion. Walker's blood-red pupils never broke away from Rayleigh, following his every movement as he got faster and faster. The shock wave of each blow reverberated through the square. Walker waited, ready to finish Hirion if Rayleigh was taken down. From the corner of his eye, he saw a messenger arrive with a parchment sealed with Lewis's crest. Looking to the sky, Walker saw Lewis floating above. Then in a flash of lightning, Lewis dove from the sky, twirling his lance above his head, aiming for the space between Hirion and Rayleigh. He crashed down, thrusting his spear into the street, and causing the earth beneath the three of them to rise upwards. Using the momentum of his fall, he pole-vaulted over Hirion, twisted in the air, and slashed down, cutting a great gash into the giant's back and drawing Hirion's attention. Hirion closed his eyes and raised his arms to block the next overhead attack. Then sliding a hand up the spear's shaft, he grabbed it and threw Lewis toward Rayleigh, just missing the other man, who stood in a ready position catching his breath. Staring from the sidelines, Lilith saw Lewis being knocked into the air and away from the battle. She reached out, trying to create a barrier of wind to cushion his momentum, but he was thrown with too much force. She only slowed him enough to prevent fatal injuries. As one of her last surviving comrades hit the ground and ragdolled through the troops, Lilith dashed after him, thickening the air behind her and softening the road using the humid air to create a mud trap that would slow down pursuers. Unable to stop his momentum, Lewis flew into Rama's cavalry, knocking over several horses and breaking his shoulder. Grunting in pain, Lewis rolled through the front line, wincing with every turn and twist of his body. His shoulder hit the ground again, and the pain knocked him unconscious. His body continued onward, knocking soldiers back and scattering the ranks. Finally he hit the wall of a bakery, stopping his momentum and breaking his collarbone. His breathing slowed as he lay against the wall. He faded in and out of consciousness, unable to move, sharp pain controlling his body, the honey-sweet aroma of days-old bread filling his nostrils and causing his stomach to gurgle. Hungry and in pain, he groaned, fighting to stay aware of his surroundings. Catching up to Lewis, she found him half unconscious under a rack of bread. Falling to the ground and scraping her knees, she reached out, her arms heavy and her hands shaking. Terrified but determined to help, she checked his pulse and wounds and did her best to stabilize him. Exhausted from the battle, she used up what little stamina she still had and passed out headfirst in his lap. Feeling severe pain at the slightest touch, Lewis forced himself to focus. His pain lessened, but he felt a weight on his legs. Finding Lilith there, he fixed her hair with his good arm, whispering,
"Thank you,"
as he stared out onto the battlefield. Through blurry eyes, he could see Rayleigh and Hirion still fighting in the town square. From out of the mountains and forests to the north, fresh and thirsty for a fight, Lestrygonian's infantry charged toward the city. Running for glory and conquest, the giant soldiers shook the ground with their feet as they poured out of the trees and plowed across the fields with reckless speed. Every stride gave the charging giants more momentum. They moved in a frenzy, not caring about their surroundings, trampling the wildlife. Their only goal was reaching their king. Ravina's orders were echoed through the Lestrygonians' army. Her tenacity and bloodlust drove her to the front of the marauding horde. Her unit dashed ahead and into the city as Ravina followed with a flood of blood-starved giants behind her. Filling the gaps in the town, they overflowed and reinforced Hirion. The Cura force sent to help Paul Vale finally arrived, charging their enhanced war horses into the stampeding Lestrygonians. The bulky armored horses, hair flowing like fire, crashed into the reinforcements. The riders, using rifles and powder bombs, slowed the giants down, unleashing a flurry of projectiles guided by sharpened eyesight and bringing down Lestrygonians in a sea of munitions. Finally the giants turned and met the charge head-on. The weight of the horses crushed bones and armor in a violent collision. The war horses stampeded into the army of giants till bodies of warriors and horses alike littered the ground and monstrous cries and groans filled the air. The once beautiful landscape continued its transformation into a land of death as the Cura cavalry chased down panicking giants. In an attempt to turn the situation around, a group of giants turned, facing the horses. The Cura soldiers, pushing too far into the forest, didn't notice the mountainous bodies coming for them. Giant teeth pierced the horses' necks, and riders were ripped from their saddles and crushed beneath their steeds. Explosions of bullets pierced the giants' bone armor and leather clothing, penetrating their thick flesh. Bodies hit the ground in masses, creating speed bumps for those who were retreating. But the trailing riders' horses caught on bone armor and the limbs of fallen Lestrygonians, slowing them down and allowing the giants' long strides to gain them distance from their pursuers. The giants vanished back into the woods, using the thick shadows as cover. Trees shook as the ground continued to rumble, getting slowly softer as the giants' distance from the pursuing army grew. As the cavalry reached the edge of the forest, the fleeing giants vanished into the mountain caves. Bestial roars echoed off the mountainsides. The Cura soldiers turned about and headed out of the woods to rejoin the foot soldiers and scouts who were making their way into Paul Vale. Arriving at Walker's flank, First Sergeant Riley and his men set up a perimeter. They forced their horses to lie down, and Riley's cavalrymen pulled out their rifles, resting the barrels on the side of their horses. Using the animals as shields, they took aim. The experienced soldier gave orders as his nervous men sat ready for another attack. Pushing his way through Walker's force, Riley caught a glimpse of the prince using his ability to manipulate blood.
Isn't that necromancy?
He wondered. Riley turned around, heading back to his command. On reaching his men, he pulled his horse to the ground and readied himself. The soldiers waited wretchedly in silence as their throats tightened from dehydration. Uncomfortable grunts of the horses broke the silence, increasing the tension in the men. Nervousness started to take over.
We aren't soldiers. We were farmers and miners. What does the commander expect us to do?
One of the soldiers asked out loud, setting off a chain reaction of nervous chatter.
Quiet down,
the first sergeant said sharply.
You need to stay calm and focused. Being anxious won't help anyone get out of this fight. But your horses will feel your anxiety and get jumpy.
The chatter died down, and the men stared silently toward the woods. A tint of evening came over the battlefield. The orange sky made it easier to see the shadows of giants moving through the trees. A single round was fired off a rifle, prompting several others to follow suit.
Hold your fire,
Riley yelled.
Save your ammo. Wait till you can see what you shoot.
The gunfire died down as the men fell back into an uncomfortable silence, waiting for the next round of attacks. Catching their breath, Rayleigh and Hirion pushed themselves away from each other. Hirion's neck shone as his necklace filtered the raw magic around him, lessening the effects of Rayleigh's power. Still fighting it out in the town square, the colliding armies created heaps of bodies in a ring around them. A massive jolt of electricity hit Rayleigh. The pain brought him to his knees. Not knowing where the lightning came from, he shifted into high gear, regaining his composure and not letting his eyes fall off Hirion. Surprised, Hirion stepped back with his giant stride to gain a little distance. Rayleigh climbed to his feet, lightning arcing from his body. Fighting through the pain, he used his raw anger to control the flames that were eating away at his flesh. His body's machines continued to amplify his natural magnetic field, creating a small storm of visible electricity. The sparks shot off in every direction. At the same time, fire danced down and around his body, mixing with the fire that still encased him. His long black hair, charged with electricity, started to float in the air. Worried for their leader's life in the one-on-one brawl, Hyrion's lieutenants closed in around Rayleigh. He expelled energy outward, the electricity acting like Tesla coils and pushing the giants away. The current created forked lightning that flashed and danced through the air, striking Hyrion and his lieutenants, and stunning them for an instant. Rayleigh, barely able to control his growing arsenal of abilities, took brief control of the organisms within him, turning his electromagnetic aura off. The heavy danger-filled air changed around the city. Walker took a step forward, turning into a cloud of black smoke as he moved into striking distance of Hyrion, and still aware of Rayleigh, who was unconscious and out of control in his berserk state. Walker's crimson eyes glowed as he felt the electricity in the air relaxing his body. The rich energy he suppressed began to leak out. He started forward, moving dexterously, reading the timing of the energy pulses from Rayleigh's body. Gracefully dodging the arcing lightning, he watched for an opening. The energy shot out at increasing range, keeping those around him pinned down. Using the strikes as cover, Walker flanked the first giant lieutenant, drew his sword in an instant, and cut the giant's head off. Hitting the ground, he dashed to the second lieutenant, sliced his target's tendons, and followed with an upward slash, splitting the man in half. Seeing the next barrage of lightning heading toward him, he danced around it, moving behind Rayleigh and out of range. Sweating and taking a deep breath, Walker sheathed his sword. His crimson eyes turned yellow as he activated his abilities. He reached out in front of him, ripping the blood from the surrounding corpses and transforming it into a wave of spears. He launched them toward the preoccupied king. Catching sight of the blood spikes, Hyrion put his hands together, and slammed them into the ground. It exploded upwards, creating a wall around him. The building swayed from the impact, but the shield of earth blocked the barrage of blood spears as they pierced and shattered everything outside. Walker focused his power on Hyrion. The blood spears shattered, sending shards in every direction. Rayleigh raised a hand, absorbing the hardened blood and using the nutrients to replenish his energy and regenerate his body. Walker was caught by surprise at Rayleigh's power over blood. For a moment, he stopped moving. Questions raced through his mind. He collected himself and returned his attention to Hyrion. The bodies around them dissolved into liquid, adding to Walker's arsenal as he continued the barrage of necromantic power. His connection to the veil grew stronger, increasing the potency of his manipulations. Fighting at a distance to avoid interference from Rayleigh, he continued to fire spears of giant's blood at the exhausted Hyrion. Slamming his foot down, Hyrion created a tremor that knocked Walker off balance and broke his spell. Catching himself and recovering, Walker dashed away, holding a hand out toward Hyrion. Bodies around Hyrion and Rayleigh exploded, wounding both men. Rayleigh's powerful self-healing repaired his damaged flesh, pushing out the shrapnel. His eyes shifted towards Walker, causing the young prince to freeze momentarily. Then he broke free of Rayleigh's gaze and put himself in a position to engage with the horde of giants. Allowing himself to enjoy the moment, he felt his connection to the veil increase once more. A voice echoed through his head, but unable to make out the words, Walker pushed it away. His skin was clammy and cold, and he felt the raw embrace of arms wrap around him. The remaining giant corpses rose, feasting off Walker's power, and he raised a small squad around Rayleigh, giving the crazed warrior a bit of defense. Then he returned to the puddles of blood, sending another wave of spears toward Hyrion. The brown sky turned crimson as the red moon shone down its blood-tinted light. Rayleigh's eyes, glazed over with blood, looked dead and lifeless. He stood still, gripping his broken weapon, surrounded by undead giants. At the sight of their risen comrade's broken flesh, the giants entering the square stopped in fear.